Greetings, folks. Greetings, world, and welcome to the Joko conversation for this evening, November 28th, the last Thursday in November, that Thursday that the United States celebrates as Thanksgiving, that many of us have rebranded as Thanksgiving. And that holiday that signals the holiday season in North America and really much of the world, as the world is structured culturally these days. So we welcome you to a conversation that we have titled "Giving Thanks for What They Take?" Question mark. Let me bring on my partner and my comrade and the initiator of the Joko, Tasha.
Greetings. Um, Greetings and abundance. And I'm going to start by invoking my main ancestor, my mom, who used to say, I'm grateful 364 days of the year. I'm taking the day off. and I know my ancestors will approve. I'm taking the day off.
Yes.
And she would articulate what what do they have to be grateful for? The indigenous people subdued and your ancestors in chains. What are you celebrating? And so with that also we go into our as we always do, cite and acknowledge that the indigenous people of the lands where we do our work for the Joko Collective is unceded. The indigenous people are still here in the LA Basin, the Tongva. I don't really like to say Gabrielino band of Mission Indians. That's not my favorite way to describe.
Not after
But
learning the actual name.
Not after learning the actual name. But you see them often coterminous, even coming from the resistant community itself.
Mm-hmm.
But that is important for African descendant persons to remember as they fight their great resistance fight with the colonizer, that we come as cargo of the colonizer and participate in this subjugation often by proxy. And of course, the histories of our alliance are well subdued. And it is a grand history. It is a grand and potent history.
Yes.
And an alliance that is always incredibly difficult to overcome. Incredibly difficult to overcome. So may we ally again. May we find a rich and abundant alliance in terms of, as we seek ourselves, may we continue to find each other in this reclamation of identity, in this reclamation of culture, right? And the culture that has us, that we share in common, that understands that the attitude of gratitude is a way of walking through the world.
Yes.
Always humble to the next life form, always humble to everything that supports you. It's a way of walking in awareness and respect and in conversation, right? And not a gratitude for an abundance of wealth as such. right? An abundance of wealth.
as such.
Um, but the wealth is in the being, right? The being with nature and all these artificial poverties that have been created um, are just that
Mhm.
artificial. Earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So
Yes.
giving thanks always. And on this day, we taking it off
Mhm.
in salutation
And solidarity.
and solidarity.
Your comments remind me of, speaking of, that the historic alliance and alliances among First Nations of the Americas and Africans, brought to what has become the Americas, Turtle Island. The I think it was maybe one of the first or very early um, Festival of the Mass, maybe, right? That is, held in Lamert Park. But I'm not sure if it was that event. That's the one I'm associated with. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
you will recall, right? We were, on site
Mm-hmm.
celebrating with folks.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the local cultural, groups, it might have
Mm-hmm.
been Danza Azteca, but I'm
It may
not
have been, yeah.
sure it was
Mm-hmm.
Danza Azteca. But one of
Mm-hmm.
the local groups who do Aztec dance performances, and
Mm-hmm.
if you recall, what the brother said, right, at this, not exclusively but primarily, African, remembrance, African memorializing for the ancestors,
Yes.
that always acknowledges, and really it's a something done in concert with, right, indigenous folks, right, and including those indigenous folks who are often identified as Chicano, Mexicana,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
etc., right, Central
Yes.
American even, right. um,
Yes.
and you recall what he said, right, the conquerors came, but they came, they took our land, but they didn't know that they brought our friends with them.
Yes.
And yes, right. They
Yes,
they
I.
they brought
Yeah.
friends of the indigenous with them, as we have, um, more often than not, and as you point out, right, one of the suppressed stories,
Mm-hmm.
worked in concert,
Mm-hmm.
recognized the commonality of our enemy, if not
Mm-hmm.
exactly the same situation as such. Though
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's important to remember that, in terms of the history of this modern
Mm-hmm.
enslavement, we
Mm-hmm.
were replacement enslaved folks, right? As they were
Yes.
running out of indigenous
Yes.
folks to enslave, and indigenous folks were able to successfully resist, move to other,
Yes.
areas, etc.
Yes.
Um, but had no ultimate resistance in the short term for the diseases of Europe and Asia, um, etc. Right? What they call the old world, though I try not to use that language either. Right? But
Yeah.
those
How
diseases
old is it?
of the
Yes.
right.
All of that.
The diseases more, but common in the Eastern Hemisphere, right? That hadn't
Mm-hmm.
made it to the Western
Mm-hmm.
Hemisphere yet. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that so they too, right, that history of
Mm-hmm.
enslavement,
Yes.
displacement, um, genocide, and from the
Yes.
very beginning, and it's a
Yes.
complex history, but more often than not, we have been allies,
Yes.
um,
And
and and victors in our allyship.
in our alliance, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, seminal so-called wars.
Hmm.
A prime example. A prime example.
Yep.
the network of Maroons communities. I was just going to say Quilombos. I was like, well, that's a specific kind or a specific place,
Hmm.
specific language. But
Yes.
yes, our Maroon communities. And these histories that need more unearthing, need more
That's right.
research, need
That's
more,
right.
right, in order to provide that evidence. Everything these days has my mind in the urgency of us figuring out,
Hmm.
folks figuring out how we're going to maintain and preserve um, the practice, the information that's the information and narratives, the work that's been done in this coming onslaught. We'll see all the different ways they're going to attack. My mind is fully expecting a burning of the library at Alexandria, um, and highlights the importance and the preciousness of the uh, of dedicating resources to research, right? To research, to uncovering and documenting these histories and propagating them. Let them become uh, the common knowledge, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's incredibly important. I was watching, and in terms of the conversations about distinction and difference, and even in the context of complex histories where we had many instances we can point out of being mistakenly aligned with the colonizers, and that goes both ways, right?
Exactly.
I was watching something that's currently on Netflix. I can't really call the name of it right now, but it was a film it's actually a Canadian film that's been made about the residential schools, right? And the horrors of the residential schools and the aim of the residential schools to kill the Indian and preserve the man,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
And, you know, yes, we tell our individual stories and our unique stories and narratives, but that aim is the same everywhere. you know
Yeah. That's
Certainly
right.
was the same with wherever you go, Australia, New
Exactly.
Zealand, on the continent. Let's make Frenchmen of these Africans,
Yes. Exactly.
and certainly.
Perfect Frenchmen, Afro Saxons, I think was a term Dr. Nathan Hare coined, I think,
mm,
the Afro Saxon, to etc. Right.
yeah,
To make perfect little Europeans or whatever of the natives.
absolutely. And this practice of outlawing culture and the practice of forbidding the languages, certainly something that the enslaved African was subjected to,
No,
certainly.
absolutely. Yes,
And
absolutely.
so you know it's been a well practiced uh war. what
Hmm.
cultural warfare,
Yeah.
maybe a cultural warfare piece, right? Excuse me. Culture, as I sit in my car doing this, cultural warfare, understanding the power of removing the cultural memory
Yeah.
and separating the subjected person from
Yes.
their cultural continuum. So we all we all have the same stories to tell,
Yeah.
oftentimes in the same language, oftentimes using the same language. And we still must tell these stories individually, in their
Hmm.
particularity, but we find it's the same story. We find it's the same story.
Hmm.
You know.
Yes. Yes, it is. But culture always runs deeper, right? I mean, it's one of the ironies of of that. These efforts to, suppress, and certainly suppress, or eliminate a race,
Mm.
often outward signs of the culture,
Mhm.
use, punishing folks, the history of punishing folks
Mhm.
for speaking in their native
Mhm.
tongue with each
Mhm.
other. And yet,
Mhm. Mhm.
American English, as one example, is
Mm.
full of African vocabulary,
Absolutely.
that has just become part of English in such a way that people don't know
Mhm.
that they're using African vocabulary. And certainly foodstuffs, right? Certainly foodstuffs like okra, you know, gumbo, banana, things like that. But even
Yes.
words like okay and
Yes.
tote, when your local PBS station wants to give away a tote bag, right? That
Yes.
they're
Yes.
this word tote coming
Tote.
into or into English, not just American English, right? Coming into English, from West African languages, uh, and the other ways in which the suppressed culture insinuates itself into the colonizers' material culture, right? In
Yeah.
terms of what they learn to eat and drink, in terms of coffee and teas and
Right.
cocoa
Right.
that come
Right.
in,
And rice.
the way in which their diet, right, is indigenous,
Yes.
potatoes, right, right,
Yes.
pumpkins, et,
Yes.
cetera, right.
Mhm.
As that people don't associate the potato, right, as
Right.
something indigenous to Turtle Island,
Right.
something indigenous,
Right.
to what, Peru.
Squash. Yeah.
But no, they think in terms of uh, Sweden or Russia, maybe for potatoes,
Mhm.
or Idaho, uh,
Yeah.
or
Right.
just in
Right.
that limited way. But the various beans, that people may or
Yes.
may not be enjoying today, um,
Yes.
and something I believe Salvador Carrasco, and I should know his name. But anyway, filmmaker, right? And who made the film maybe some 20 years ago now, The Other Conquest.
Mhm.
And one of the things it looks at is the ways in which, the indigenous culture insinuated itself into and survived through, or in spite of, right, the dominant culture, around such figures as the Virgin of Guadalupe, for example,
Mhm.
or or our familiar use of the Catholic saints, to represent the various Orisha,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
because culture is deep, right, and no matter how much they did actively suppress that cultural expression and try to remake us,
Mhm.
as new kinds of Europeans,
Mhm.
even if those Europeans are called
Mhm.
Australian or American or Canadian
Mhm.
or Brazilian. uh,
Mhm.
we are who we are, right? The
Mhm.
culture remains. It remains. It's evident in our language.
Yes.
I talked about that African vocabulary that's come into just American English, and that has been um, that kind of vocabulary has been cataloged in Cuban Spanish, Brazilian
Mhm.
Portuguese, Colombian Spanish. I mean, you name it. Mexican Spanish.
Mhm.
For
Mhm.
example, there is no Spanish or indigenous etymology for menudo. It's a,
Mhm.
it's a Congolese word, a
Mhm.
tripe soup from the Congo.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
the ways in which, right, the
Mhm.
culture it remains, right, but it just
Mhm.
gets renamed, and that's part of the project, right? That reclamation,
Yes.
renaming, and reclaiming.
Yeah. Renaming, reclaiming, um, archiving, canonizing,
Archiving. Yeah.
establishing in continuum,
Hmm.
these
Hmm.
ideas and these, and these informations,
And these
that,
informations.
that tracks these processes,
Hmm.
tracks these presences,
Hmm.
lest we, you know, forget,
Hmm.
that Mississippi is Mississippi,
Right.
and this is an indigenous place name. Dakota, Manhattan, any number that
And
can be
even
named, any
even
number.
Arizona, that people might think means arid zone, but no,
Huh, huh.
it's actually an indigenous name.
Mhm. Mhm. Um and this is what has to be propagated, what has to be
Hmm.
contextualized, because yeah, it can be unknown, taken for granted. It can miss the remarkable, oh gee, we have
Hmm.
all these New Hampshires, New Englands, these, how do we get these
The New
kinds of little
Orleans. Hmm.
funny, yeah, these little kind of funny names, especially down south, and think it's some kind, I don't know what people make of that, you know what I'm saying? But I know that I used to make of it, that it was some kind of, dismissed it as just some kind of idiosyncrasy of Southern language. You
Hmm.
know what I'm saying? Somehow, some kind of idiosyncratic piece, with that, is happening in Southern language, and specifically, right, among Europeans, European Southerners, and it's in, one must be able to put the meat on the bones, and clarify uh exactly, who and what and where we are. um Language that is currently being appropriated, standout items that people in our generation would probably never imagine would cross into and cross over and be absorbed. Booty, now
Hmm.
booty has become mainstreamed, as well as bougie
Hmm.
has become mainstreamed, which is hecka interesting, the
Hmm.
bougie part, hecka interesting. Um, but yeah, definitely becoming mainstreamed. You hear it in commercials, you hear it used in, you know what I'm
Hmm.
saying?
Yes, yes,
Um,
you know what you're saying.
by Yeah.
Because that ongoing process, right, and primarily through popular culture,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
these
Mm-hmm.
and political discourse. I mean, that's one of the things I keep thinking about in terms of this attack on woke, right, and so-called
Mm-hmm.
wokeness.
More of
And
our language. Yeah.
but that yeah, that it is not just an attack on whatever, however, the right and the liberal center is understanding woke. But yes, that's right. It does come from our youth's culture.
Mm-hmm.
And there
Mm-hmm.
I do read an incipient anti-blackness in it, right?
Absolutely. Right.
Because yeah,
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um,
there. But as you're talking, so the stories you're talking about, right, that need to be told, that we're trying to tell, um, you know, the kinds of gaps that are in the historical narratives, um, the stories of these alliances, I mean, these are the very narratives that are coming under attack, right, by those in power
Absolutely.
and those coming to power,
Yes.
particularly the so for you mentioned or anticipating a burning of the libraries at Alexandria
Mm-hmm.
type of moment. Um, right now. Well, I'm wondering, right? Because as an educator, um, well, I've already thought about what that means in my classroom, right? And um, what content, right? I'm thinking to choose, or choosing like for next semester. As I decide, I can just say for myself, I'm doubling down, right? I'm trying to get the other side of the story out, so to speak, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm just and so I'm leading up to a question that should is real, which is really just when you think about teachers and teachers you've with whom you've worked, how because this has been coming, right? And there've been these attacks, right? How do you see them responding? um, Hollywood High, Crenshaw High, Dorsey, where all the various places, right, that you've had a chance to teach or work
Yeah,
with teachers.
I think it is very site specific, specific, very site specific. Um, LAUSD as a uh, as an entity has communicated, to its constituencies, its parent teacher community through like public service announcements going
Mm-hmm.
out to that community, its dedication to diversity, its dedication to, articulating that. And so I think that, I mean, might have as much to do with the um, mayoral and gubernatorial politics and feeling a support and alignment through that
Mm-hmm.
lineage, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Um, as anything else, and beyond that, site specific, So going back to what that articulation looks like coming from um, the superintendent's office, um, the commitment to representing the stories of marginalized communities, and of protecting all of our students. And, so there is a specific call out to LGBTQ plus um, student community that has, had uh, a rush of support,
Mm-hmm.
in what the last decade, um,
Mm-hmm.
and with the latest uh, iteration or the latest insertion of AP studies, AP ethnic studies, and the insertion of ethnic studies as a requirement
Yes.
into the curriculum. You know, that is something they were doing before it was cool. You know, that's been a long time coming. So
Mm-hmm.
that says to me that um, there are folks that have some kind of established politic that have
Mm-hmm.
been, working uh, in their administrative roles for a while. Beyond that, it's site specific because what, site administrators do and allow and pressure and,
Mm-hmm.
is school to school. In like when I did the stay at Dorsey, the long-term stay, um, at Dorsey High, there's definitely uh there's definitely a progressive politic, right? In a number of schools that I've been in, um, there's a distinct progressive politic, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, while I was at Dorsey, I had a student teacher to that was also, let me just throw that in. Dorsey is, a site of an AP African American Studies pilot program, right? Um, and also is the school home of one of the proponents and
Right.
the lead supporter and the lead proponent, I should say, of AP African American Studies, right? A progressive politic, not as progressive as some sites. On the other hand, as I was saying, I had a student teacher to tell me of her experience. Her partner had the experience of having something about Palestine in her room posted, and it wasn't. She said it wasn't a free Palestine from the river to the sea. It wasn't but there was just something about Palestine, and the administrators, scrutinized it and brought her partner under pressure for, what I'm saying, in terms of, so site to site, site to site. I think it's a time where we're going to see how people act. We're going to see
Mm-hmm.
what people do. You know,
Mm-hmm.
what is it? When the revolution comes,
Yeah.
straight heads are going to be wearing afros, and afros are going to straighten out their head. Are going to be straightening their hair. So, remains to be seen. But that's how I would characterize it. That's how I would characterize it
Mm-hmm.
in a overall context and verbalization of resisting
Mm-hmm.
any kinds of attacks on curriculum and attempts to denature a
Mm-hmm.
progressive um curriculum, you know um
All right.
you know
And yeah, a progressive curriculum, and I think that folks need to be, specific about that, and
yeah,
uh, uh, assertive about that, right? That
yeah,
a progressive curriculum. I the the right wing attacks on education, which have been going on for decades.
yeah,
In many ways, what's being proposed now is stuff that they've been working for decades.
yeah,
Because the attack on ethnic studies has been around since there's been ethnic studies, and
yeah.
since the emergence of the first Black Studies programs, and La Raza Studies and Chicano Studies programs. There's been an
Mhm.
attack, and a minimizing or a demonizing of the scholarship, right? That people,
Mhm.
and in many ways, these competing narratives on a campus, right? In the ethnic
Mhm.
studies department, and then another story being told in the traditional history department and anthropology and archaeology departments, and
Mhm.
departments of Near Eastern studies, etc. Right? That,
Mhm.
but that we know though have historically been partners of the empire, partners in
Mhm.
imperialism, and an important
Mhm.
part with the intellectual wing of the empire, the intellectual wing of capitalism.
Mhm.
The So that tension has always been there, and now there are forces feeling empowered in a particular
Mhm.
way. um and again, we've already seen it, right? That with the struggle over the AP curriculum in Florida,
Yes. Mhm.
which from all reports is itself not especially radical.
Absolutely.
um, but that's important, right? Because what it's about is um, them wanting to control every aspect of the narrative, right? And how it's going to be
Yes.
told and how it's going to be framed. And
Right.
And and, I mean, yeah, just that, right? How it's going to be told and how it's going to be framed. I don't know what conversations have happened in the Santa Monica College English department since the election and the possibility of loss of federal funding, whatever, right? These various things that might happen. Santa Monica College does now have an ethnic studies department. What that's going to mean. Now, we also, the college also released a statement, right, of commitment to diversity, commitment to our undocumented students, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But we don't know what that looks like yet when the pressure might be put on. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's Santa Monica College is not going to be
Mm.
unknown to some of these folks, just knowing that Stephen Miller is from Santa Monica, right? Santa
Mm-hmm.
Monica High School's own, as far as
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the but it's a teaching institution primarily.
Mm-hmm.
I know we
Mm-hmm.
were talking earlier about the point that
Mm.
that Dr. Gabriel Rockhill has been making in terms of the limits that are being put on, what can even be taught, what kinds of conversations
Mm-hmm.
are encouraged and which ones are discouraged, or at least attempts are eliminated in one way or another,
Mm-hmm.
at the university, right, and the academy broadly speaking. But particularly at these universities, um, I remember at the beginning of my career, um, being told, and actually before I ever, began teaching at a community college, that there was a certain element of autonomy, I guess, one could have
Mm-hmm.
at community college, right? And um,
Mm-hmm.
that of the community college, and then after it, the state colleges, like the CSU system, were places where you could often be more innovative, um, particularly in terms of teaching,
Mm-hmm.
because there's less pressure to
Mm-hmm.
research and write, right? The publish
Mm-hmm.
or perish becomes less of an issue um, there. The And so often the faculty at the either of these levels are often sometimes willing to take more chances, or or be more innovative, right? And what that's going to look like now does remain to be seen. If we have discussed it at an English department meeting yet, I don't know, because the English department meetings conflict with my teaching schedule, and so I can't make it to them. Um, but I know it will come up, right, at the and it will come up at the beginning of the spring semester, right? There will be a department-wide meeting to open the semester, and I know it will be discussed. And by then, the new administration will be in place, and so this call, right, to teach patriotism, and the threat to defund colleges if they aren't in somehow in compliance with what the administration, I guess,
Yeah.
deems
One doesn't
patriotic
know.
enough,
Right.
right? So
Whatever is deemed.
you
Yeah.
know so we'll see, right?
Yeah.
We're going to see what that ends up meaning.
Yeah.
um but I know within my department, I expect there was going to be a lot of pushback, and within the field, the more or less the way English composition and literary analysis has been taught for the last couple of decades, or some of its um, uh, uh, thematic focus and has been primarily, and I don't want to overstate it, but has been primarily progressive looking, um, even in the notion that anyone can learn to write a decent essay
Mm-hmm.
if the time is taken, right, to
Mm-hmm.
work with a person, right? That
Mm-hmm.
writing skills, these kinds of literacy skills can and
Mm-hmm.
should be democratized.
Mm-hmm.
In the best sense of that term, I guess, right? That there should be a widespread skill, not a skill for elites only,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or for a privileged few. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but part of that even starts with the principle that anyone can
Mm-hmm.
learn this and be effective
Right.
at
Right.
the and so Jay, so I want to overstate it because there's certainly conservatives in English departments, etc. But the general gist of it, right, has been,
Mm-hmm.
fairly progressive. At least
Mm-hmm.
at least dedicated to developing critical thinking skills.
Mm-hmm. Which is not, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, because and in many ways, because that's our mandate, right, is to teach critical thinking skills, right? Composition, how to critically read something, how to apply critical thinking to one's everything, right? To any other
Mm-hmm.
work that one does, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so even those who may not be, actually politically progressive are committed to that. The importance
Mm-hmm.
of critical thinking and
Mm-hmm.
critical engagement to make an informed decision about whether one wants to be progressive
Which
or
is which
conservative.
is the piece right there, because at some
Mhm.
point critical exercises are going to have to involve comparison and contrast. So you're going to have to
Exactly.
engage uh, difference and differentials, and what those differences. I mean, that can, that can be argued, because you can certainly argue, or present differences, have a comparison and contrast practice, um, with differences in the same, in the same school, in the same mode, in the same, you know, the same basic trend and outlook. Um, but the commitment, what it is, not in critical thinking is not in concert with, um, patriotism. How does one teach patriotism? Patriotism is a uh is very much an individual passion. It's an individual experience, and it's individual commitment to to a certain set of ideals, and
Mhm.
right.
Mhm.
um how does one teach sentiment? You know what I mean?
Well, that's just
Which,
it. Yeah.
how does one, I mean, not that it can't be done, we know how it's done, we
Well,
know how it's done,
what is that
but this
teaching, right?
this direct and explicit call for that, how
Mhm.
it'll be very interesting to see how,
Mhm.
how this ambiguous, you know um very ambiguous realm of teaching patriotism gets exercised in the
Mhm.
context of, um things like the Department of Justice being able to arbitrarily accuse uh nonprofit, or not, various civil society, the attack on civil society, and nonprofit
Mhm.
organizations are able to be accused of being terrorist allied, or terrorist supporting, or terrorist whatever. you
Mhm.
know that's just a hop, skip, and a jump. from maybe even not a skip and a jump, just a hop, over to accusing intellectuals,
Hmm.
dissenters, with
Yes.
criticizers of
Yes.
American policies. Um,
Yes.
you know, so it's full scale. It's full
Hmm.
scale, and I think there'll be a lot of learning as we go. One of the things that I have been, that I always kind of talk about and really wonder what this will begin to look like in practice. What does this look like in practice is the importance of bringing these conversations out of our bubbles and into at least our friends and family zone. How
Hmm.
to, and it's important because we don't have political discourse in the country. We don't have spaces for, we have pundits, we have political conversation, we have, political programming of one kind or another, but as a matter of culture, the culture is, as we know, anti-intellectual and doesn't have as just kind of has not, does not normalize civil discourse, right? How do we have a discussion around politics and varied, yeah, right, various um various approaches to organizing society and these kinds of things. Even the notion that there is choice, you know, um when it comes to organizing society. And I do think, though, in trying to have these kinds of conversations, friends and family conversations outside of the bubble, I think it will definitely create an indice, of what are some of these areas and ways of approach, and the necessity for the practice of deep and active listening, you know, to, really hearing folks' concern was like one of the things that I wanted us to touch on a little bit tonight in this Thanks-taking program. Um, how to have a discussion at the Thanks-taking dinner, at the Thanksgiving dinner, about Thanks-taking and or about any other things, and I just started to enter a conversation before I came to jump on. But the conversation was about pronouns, and I don't know exactly why or how we got there. I think it was kind of spontaneous because the door opened on with one family member saying, yeah, talking about saying of his brother, yeah, he's into um the Black history stuff and he's into this and that, and asked me, and how did you get into it? Because your mom was kind of into that, right? And how did you get into that? And so spontaneous discussion, that ended up left off at, what do you think about this pronoun business? And which opens the door also to talk about, the context of the trans panic and all kind of LGBTQIA panic that has been generated, to create a wedge, between folks's under notion of inclusion and civil rights and whatnot, to create a general other in the society. Well, who is who do all communities claim discomfort with? What can, and use that as a way to sidle in this attack on civil rights, basically, you know.
Hmm.
But all of that is to say, all of that reflection is to say how we engage the practice of civil discourse, how we engage the information gaps and the information gaps. because these conversations don't happen. Any kind of conversations that is needed and worthwhile is a sustained conversation that happens over time. It's ongoing. It is constant, if we're having a normalized, um, a culture that normalizes intellectual exercise, you know.
Yeah.
Before we came on, we were talking about, or earlier today, we were talking about, but which we have talked about before and made mention of, but the the problem of literacy in this country, the problem of basic functional literacy in this country, not to mention
Yes.
um, knowledge base and
Right.
um, the implications for folks being able to make sound political assessments, kind of understand when they're being hoodwinked, bamboozled, and led astray versus, someone talking sense. But who's the last person who's had any kind of megaphone that has actually talked sense? It's all smoke and mirrors and display and performance, and it's all
That's a
a
very good
sideshow.
question. That's a very good question. Who is talking sense? Um, who has the megaphone, right? The large audiences. I mean, certainly nobody coming in the mainstream, right? I mean, there are those who are talking within
Yeah,
the norm, within the expected norms,
yeah,
um, but they aren't saying anything that is going to be, very useful to people. I mean,
yeah,
they aren't
yeah,
fighting to defend the kinds of programs that are necessary to fill those gaps you're talking about. That it didn't just happen. I mean, these are, all of this is by design, right? This dismantling of the kind of educational system that would make it possible for people to, uh, get a deep and profound, um, critical education, and an education that's even structured in a way that will encourage curiosity, that will,
yes,
and in fact, I think efforts were being made in the mid 20th century to leave behind the factory model, right, of education,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
change the
mm-hmm,
architecture of a classroom, and those efforts happened, and there some of the effects are still with us, and in terms of how some teachers may set up the desk or the tables in their
right,
classroom and doing
right,
collaborative work and all that.
right,
But that it really, we know that folks are being forced to do things on a shoestring budget.
right,
Um, that
as it
that
is.
Just that simple, right? Uh, um, Funding makes a huge difference. The ability to attract people to the profession who would love to do the profession
Yeah,
and do so as a vocation and be rewarded for it so that they can live a decent standard of life, not have to take a second job,
yeah,
spend enough on every student,
yes,
but decouple it from local property values and whatnot. And
absolutely.
all of this because of a politics of resentment coming out,
Yes,
that
yes,
here in California, right, the infamous
yes.
Proposition 13.
13, right.
Um,
Yes,
the effort can be made, but again, the effort has been made, again, very specifically to defame the schools, to say they aren't working, to
Right.
defund them so that they don't
Right.
work,
Right.
to overcrowd them
Right.
so that a teacher can't teach.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
Schooling has been made into these hellscapes,
Yes.
whereas the private school system um,
Yes.
is being organized in these very humane ways. Although I
According
think
to,
it has to be
in
said also that private school teachers are grossly underpaid,
right.
grossly
Right.
underpaid, right?
But
And are
what a,
making
but it's
making an exchange, right? So they don't have to teach a crowd, right? And can have a
exactly,
class of 15.
yes, a place where an atmosphere and a structure where teaching can take place in
Where they can
alignment,
actually teach.
that which aligns with whatever the research standard is. And per usual, I mean, it's not different. It's not different. It is at a premium. It's behind a paywall.
And it's behind
So,
a paywall. A
while
very
wealthy
expensive
kids,
paywall.
I'm sorry?
A very expensive paywall.
Very expensive paywall. And so, whereas now wealthy kids are doing hybrid learning and, are doing these curricula that honors community time and family time, and the research that says it is better for folk to start a school day at 9 o'clock and end the school day at 2 o'clock. No, you know what I'm saying? And within that span and do 3 days, uh uh excuse me, doing 3 days on campus, 2 days off campus. Let's just put it like that, right? Hybrid learning model. Um and that this is, that this fosters creativity, this fosters, not to mention an emphasis on self-directed learning and self-teaching, and that's encouraging that kind of work from students. um it's very, it's very interesting. And like during the time that my daughter was in a school that worked in that way, you know. And I wouldn't have had the language to describe it. I just knew that they were doing all the things, that they described themselves as human centered when they were starting. They described themselves, in a certain way. And then they fundamentally, uh, just fundamentally asserted themselves as a revolutionary education, as a liberatory education practice,
Mm-hmm.
and made it explicit. Um, Something else that is interesting is to see a backlash from the learner. A lot of the students would say, but as many students were enjoying and in praise of, and like, yes, how much I got out of it, and this, that, and the other. There was a, a, a counter voice saying, but is this real school? Or is this really preparing us?
Yeah.
This sense that it wasn't legitimate. The approach wasn't legitimate
Right.
because it was relaxed, because it
Yeah.
was,
Exactly.
all this self-direction,
It's
small community of
because it goes
learners, all of
against
this sort. Is
all
this
of the
real?
theories, right? That this is not what real school does, right?
Right.
There are
And the
no
notion that
bells.
this,
Real schools
they're
have
not really
bells.
learning. Yeah, and this isn't really teaching, which, is, part of the problem is folk, for instance, try to promote and establish abolitionist values, anti-carceral values. It takes two to tango, and there's a place in which, it's a carceral society and people believe in being policed, which is
Yeah.
actually the translation into the factory school system, the, that institutionalized setting, that kind of regimentation and martial setting. It's a translation. So if I'm not being policed, if I'm not being coerced, if I'm not being spoon fed, if I'm not being, regimented, then it's not it's not real, and
because
it's not preparing me for the real world.
it is disorienting,
When,
right? You are not oriented
yes,
in that way, right? And so,
yes,
but one will reorient. I mean, it takes time. Um,
yes, and also I think that um, the in terms of choices for um, higher education, the kinds of choices that are available for higher education, it definitely prepares you to function in a small liberal arts, intimate style kind. You
mhm,
know what I'm saying?
mhm.
And suspiciously, it's the mode of education that elites are choosing
Well,
because it
that's
fosters free
exactly
thinking and creativity and
because all things that they
agency.
do not want the masses to do, they make sure their children are getting
Yes,
language education from kindergarten on up, while they're trying to take away your bilingual education in the public school.
absolutely.
Absolutely everything that they
Yes,
don't want to happen. When I
in
taught at
public school.
Windward School,
That's right.
my
Yes,
God, the arts program that was
yes,
going on there. And
right,
appropriately enough, as the school
right.
originally founded by poet, Shirley Windward, and she wanted it to be different. And indeed, by the time I left there, the controversy was that it was no longer in her vision. It was becoming too much of
Mm,
this highly competitive
mm,
um, type of place, right? That was causing students to have ulcers and stuff, right?
mm-hmm,
And getting back to Shirley Windward's vision,
hmm,
but the arts, while arts are being cut, again, public schools,
yes,
yeah, people were paying a pretty penny to send their children to that school, 7th through 12th grade, to for just the sorts of educational practices that you are describing.
yes,
Innovation,
yes,
that kind of engagement, project centered stuff,
yes,
smaller classrooms, one day set aside, or at least a big chunk of the day set aside for what was called advising. So they get out of their regular classes and then another grouping of students, and all these various things, right? And
yeah, yeah,
psychologists on site and
right.
college
All the
counselors
things,
on site. A
all the
military
things.
recruiter did not step one foot on that campus the entire year. College recruiters, not
Yeah,
military recruiters,
yeah,
not even West Point or any of the military academies. Okay,
yeah,
and yes, and as I was told at the time, it was in many ways an industry school. That is, folks in the entertainment industry. Many of them sent their children there, but not exclusively, right? And
yeah,
there were kids there on scholarship, but they were far and few, and getting a different type of education about
mm-hmm,
the difference
mm-hmm,
between the way they lived in their neighborhoods and this place,
mm-hmm,
where they were uh,
mm-hmm,
privileged, right, to be able to
yeah,
go. Um,
yeah,
the
yeah,
Every student, right, was enrolled in some arts class, and at
mm,
some point during, if they were to stay there the 4 years, right, would be taking voice, would learn an instrument,
mm-hmm,
have to take theater at
mm-hmm,
some point, or some
mm-hmm,
aspect of theater arts, right?
mm-hmm,
Uh, Technical or performance,
mm-hmm,
would take
mm-hmm,
painting or photography or something, right?
mm-hmm,
Still central, right, to encourage that creativity, not an elective as such, but required.
right,
The
right,
I mean, again, very high paywall. Um, that the sort that might as well be college in terms of
yeah,
what you have to pay or the debt a parent may have to go into. Um,
yeah,
because we are not insisting
Right.
that our public schools be structured as such.
Absolutely. And that's what it takes, right?
We have to
That
demand
insistence.
that, yes.
Um, and to have that insistence and make those demands, there's a need for background, there's a need for knowledge, there's a need for that kind of awareness, of and everything connects with everything else, right? Because what is because I like literally in a lesson that I used to do with classes where I could, which was often um,
Mhm.
in high schools, was this, we would read an article about the optimal school day and,
Mhm.
relative to sleep studies and sleep and brain and learning and this, that, and the other, and the need, the idea of, starting at 9, all of this getting up before dawn and all of that is for the birds. You need to, right? And so read an article about, the science and the conflict, the way it conflicts with, the work schedule, with with the industrial work schedule, you know. And so the obvious question is, well, but you know, who's going to take the kids to school, and how is that, this is, the knee jerk sense that this is absurd because I got to go to work. You know what I mean? Got to go to work. It conflicts with with this work schedule. So it takes us into another realm, in terms of questions, first of all, of disparity. Who can afford, who has the luxury to take their kid to school at 9 and pick them up at 2?
And
Takes
pick
us
them up at
right
2,
straight into disparity, right? And it
right?
also takes us into the school day being organized around the the needs of the business cycle, the
Well,
needs for the. I'm
where my
sorry.
mind went. You know where my mind went.
Huh.
Well, okay, let's restructure the workday then too,
Exactly.
right?
Precisely. That's where I'm trying to go. If I
Yeah,
was a little too roundabout, that's where I'm going with that. It opens up this door to examine why the workday is structured the way it is,
the way it is. Yeah,
and is that day structured in that way of necessity, um, and can take us
right.
into a whole conversation about how many days a week people actually need to work and how many hours per week
And
people actually need to
we can
work.
start having those conversations. Yes, exactly.
Those kinds of conversations, and because all, in the ways that all of this is interrelated, and it kind of sneaks us back around to, the premise of the program of our conversation tonight. Are we giving thanks for the taking, um just the just in terms of a way of, of looking at that, is that kind of, the way folk, give thanks for certainly more subtle things and material things. They give thanks for, friendships, for the people in their lives, for the, in this in this circumscribed day. And I'm not, not trying to make paint with too broad a brush. I know that people don't only feel gratitude one day a year, but this circumscribed day, commercially rendered, you know, close enough to us in historically to be able to understand that it is absolute myth and hogwash, right? But it has been wrapped in a holiness, you know, really, to the point
Mm.
that folk feel like, it's a historical holiness,
The religion
and I think
teaching
folks,
system that you were
clearly
talking
take
about
it
earlier.
as it did have as much religious significance as does Christmas,
Yeah,
you know.
it's
have this kind of,
it is part of
this
the
kind.
American patriotic narrative, right? Even though it's like
a-
pre the United States, it's
yes.
it's part of that, right? It's the prequel to the United States, I guess, right? But yeah, that's right.
Yes, but it leads
It
to
takes
all of those
on
kinds of religiosities
exactly.
about the origin story of the United
Yeah,
States,
and the
and
description of it as a promised land for these folks, right?
absolutely, absolutely. And folks will are, it raises an interesting question because the usual refrain is that, yeah, but, really what this is about is friends and family, and the emphasis is on the thanksgiving and the righteousness of gratitude, you know. Um, and this question of, can can these things actually be separated? Is there a way to um, celebrate Thanksgiving without uplifting the all of the you know uh, perversions of historical narrative, you know, that come along with it, that come along with the premise. And certainly people are doing a lot of creative things, but a lot of us in American society aren't, you know, we are in the extension of the, commercial cycle. you know, it's the commercial religious calendar, you know, and there's all kinds of taking, you know, that is happening um as we think about thanks taking, you know, certainly beginning with the lie of friendship and harmony and settledness among the colonizer and the vanquished, the colonizer and the notion that there is a vanquished, the notion that are all the Indians gone? Aren't they? Are there any Indians left? You know,
Well, it
the
depends on
notion
where you
that
live,
the
how you live in
invisibilizing, the
that.
successful
Yeah.
invisibilizing of indigenous people, um, as well,
Mhm.
along with that um, heavy coating of commercialization that is, the beginning, as you said earlier, the kickoff for the holiday season, huge spending season, huge
Well, it's
commercial
all of those
season.
things. It's all of those things that you said, right? I mean, what is there to add to that? I mean, really, it is all of those things.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, what do people do about it? I mean, they do
Right.
any number of different things. I mean, folks do. So, some people have invented the friendsgiving, right? And
Yeah.
and okay, I mean, all right then. Does that just mean what, Thanksgiving dinner with friends and not family? I mean, just
Mhm.
whatever.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it has always been um, or maybe I shouldn't say always, but certainly for most of my adult life, um, a deeply contradictory day for me, and especially during the time I lived apart from my family and
Mhm.
probably made only 2 trips a year to visit family. So one of those would often be Thanksgiving because I knew everyone would likely be together.
Would be together.
At the
Yes.
same time, I'm like, well, I'm not going to get up and go to the sunrise ceremony at
Alcatraz.
Alcatraz
Right. Yeah.
because I'm going to go ahead and travel because this was my one chance, that
Right.
I'll be able to see my mother, my
Yep.
aunts, my cousins all in one place for this one day, and then maybe I've got the Friday to be around before I got to head back. to Bay Area to be at work or whatever, right? And it has remained that, right? And that and we were not folks other than what folks would do in school, because that's another thing, right? Is what happens in school where you make your little hand turkey and stuff,
Absolutely.
whatever happens at home.
Right.
We were not folks even growing up. I don't recall like Thanksgiving decorations or any of that type
Right.
stuff.
Right.
Stories of pilgrims and
Right.
other than whatever was happening in school and different things that might come on television, like the Charlie Brown Thanksgiving.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so I think that's what people are there, right? They're in that, right? What do we do? Um,
Mhm.
and we get together, and it's like, well, you get together yeah, other times of the year. Now, for me, when I was in the Bay Area, I wasn't around for those other times that family got together. Um,
Right.
so I was making a choice to either come down for the Thanksgiving holiday or the Christmas holiday, one or
Yeah.
the other,
Yeah.
and then whatever little time I would have in summer. The
Yeah.
For other people, right? I think it's the same thing, right?
Mhm.
They're having to make a choice.
Yes.
Whatever my personal feeling about this, I have family who don't feel this way,
Mhm.
or who don't embrace the pilgrim story,
Mhm.
but do,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
it's carved out on the calendar, right?
It's carved out on the calendar,
We
and
got the
industry
weekend
is
off,
organized around it. So
so we can do this thing, or
everybody has the day off. Everybody shows up because everybody's got
everybody got the
at
day off.
least that day off, probably a couple of days.
So
So
there
yeah.
is at least, if
Mhm.
nothing, raises the opportunity for conversation, right? That
Mhm.
we don't come together to give thanks, right? We come
Mhm.
together, because we're family or what
Mhm.
have you, right? And even if you are in a place where a prayer of thanksgiving is given, people give thanks for different things, right? However they're going to do it. And for immigrants, it's part of becoming American.
Absolutely.
It's whatever your ethnic dish you put at the meal.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Um, it's part of becoming American.
Yes.
You know
It's an
the
American it's right. It's
Because it is an
just that.
American
An
holiday.
American holiday,
You know and
religio
the other place
historical.
that celebrates a Thanksgiving Day is Canada, and they do it sometime in October. And
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
around some of the same themes, not the Pilgrim story, but it was some of the
Right.
same things. So these Anglo-Saxon countries. But
Mhm.
like you say, right? They're like your mom, right? I
Mhm.
give thanks 364 days a year,
I'm taking this day
365 on
off.
the year,
Yes.
right? The and this That's, I think, a lot of people, and there are other festivals of Thanksgiving, harvest festivals or festivals of Thanksgiving.
Uh-huh.
Kwanzaa as a festival of
Right.
Thanksgiving in that sense.
Right.
I was thinking of that um, the Eucharist, right, and the Christian sacrament of the Eucharist. That Eucharist is a Greek word that means Thanksgiving. Every
Mm.
celebration of the Eucharist is a Thanksgiving
Mm.
celebration, and indeed, technically a Thanksgiving meal, right? If if there's a communion, because there's a communion and all that, that
Mhm.
Thanksgivings, forms of Thanksgiving are built in to most cultures, right? And this is the one built into this culture, and it is built into this culture to indoctrinate,
Yes.
ideologize,
Yes.
to incorporate one into to a sense of belonging to the nation. I mean, all of those
Absolutely.
various things. But I think within that,
Absolutely.
people do oppositional things even within it, right? People
Yes.
do oppositional things
Yes.
within it. The but
Yes.
that doesn't mean one thing. At the very least, we don't have to reproduce the story, right? We don't have to.
Yes.
We can actually tell the real story.
Yes.
These original Thanksgivings were for for thanks for being able to massacre native villages, and that's what the Pilgrims and other settlers were giving thanks for.
Yes. And
We at
to
least we can share that.
enslave these Africans, and right, and to uh establish our flow of indentured servants and
Hmm.
to from our
Hmm.
motherlands.
Hmm.
And this is what creates the bounty. This is what
This is what
the
creates the
creates
bounty.
begins our, and I'm using the other hour,
Mhm.
you know, uh the way in which we will be settled and begin to accumulate wealth and political power, or
Mhm.
or martial power, be
Mhm.
able to, we're getting ourselves in the position to set up shop for the
Mhm.
rest of what the settler colony has been about. And it's about all these things. It's about all these things. Because if you're going to have a discussion about Thanksgiving, at some point, someone has to say, and doesn't have to be someone who is dissenting from the Thanksgiving practice, but someone would have to say, well, of course, Thanksgiving is really about, and then explain the historical context,
Mhm.
like I was imagining as we were talking, a child asking, what does this have to do with Jesus? You know what I'm saying? Or what does this have to do with God? Or what does this have to, and the parent being in the position of having to explain the history, that this is a historical holiday. Well, baby, we're always grateful to God, but this holiday is, and we're, giving
That
thanks,
depends
and
on
we're
the parent, though,
expressing this
doesn't it?
gratitude, but it's about the history of the so at some point
But
it's
that
going to
depends on the
resolve
parent, doesn't it?
to the mytho history. Say it again.
Doesn't that depend on the parent and even their
Of course, it
ability to
depends on
tell
the
that
parent, but
story?
that's what I'm talking about. The parents outside the bubble. I'm talking about, I'm deliberately making a generality, and attempting to um, imagine what happens in the practicing household, in the Thanksgiving practicing household, that hasn't considered dissent, or hasn't considered the implications, for all of the reasons that we've, already discussed. You know what I'm saying? That lack of information, the invisibilizing of First Nations people, the invisibilizing of that history, because in fact that historical continuum and narrative has been assimilated, has been ingested, is part of the body, right? Um, and we don't just think of uh alternatives. We don't just, necessarily, they don't just sprout up, But in any event, yeah, um, it eventually becomes so what do we want to collectively do about that? And I think most folk, or what I've observed thus far, over the years, is just kind of oh, this is a non-issue. You make too much of things. This is just about family and family's opportunity to get together, and our love for each other, and good food, and you know that's what we're here to do. you know so hence the outlines of the contradiction, what the contradiction looks like, in
Yeah.
real time. um
Yeah.
but it's also okay, because it's good and it's hearty if people don't reject, because there's also a kind of a habit of rejecting. What is it? You don't talk religion, sex, or politics. you know um that habit and that practice, um
Well, I didn't know the sex part. I knew the, religion or politics. I do. Sex has been added to it.
Um, you know what? I've always heard it and learned it as religion, sex, and politics. So I
Yeah.
didn't know it to be just religion and
Well, yeah,
politics.
I'd
I've
only
always
heard that version. You don't discuss religion or politics at the whatever, or sometimes,
okay.
with anybody at any time. That thing you were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah.
There's a culture that mitigates against against civil discourse,
Yes.
uh,
Yeah.
um, in so many ways. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know. People people do
Day by
different things.
day, you figure it
Yeah,
out. Yeah.
exactly. People do. I mean, um, certainly, I certainly didn't make any special plans. You know,
Yeah.
in fact, to the point that my mother decided to go to my sisters. Right?
Yeah.
And then I learned, that, oh, okay, my daughter decided she was going to cook. And,
Mm-hmm.
so okay,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
And I got my invite from my cousin, and because as many, I think I'm certainly not the only person in this configuration, but my families are not close knit,
mhm,
and that literally conscious and deliberate,
mhm,
um, taking advantage of those invitations to
mhm,
try to make family
mhm.
connections, because
Yes.
as you said, this is the chance to be with family.
Mhm.
Um, and so, there's no regret there, you know.
Right. Yeah.
And if asked,
Exactly.
they can, I'll explain to them about my land back t-shirt that
Mhm,
I'm wearing, you know.
mhm. Yes.
And it's a discussion that we must begin to learn to have,
Mhm.
that keeps us connected and keeps us in familyhood.
Yes. Well, I think I can't remember the brother's name now. Ben. I can't remember Ben's last name. Um, and he made a commentaries that used to be posted on Black Agenda Report, blackagendareport.com. And he did one for Memorial Day. And I remember him saying, the gist of the little, report statement, not sure what to call it, audio essay, um,
Mhm.
was, yes, we celebrate Memorial Day, not because we celebrate the soldiers of the empire, but
Mm,
we celebrate our fallen comrades, those
mm,
who gave their life for the resistance, those who gave their
mm,
life in the liberation struggle. They need to be memorialized. All right, so we're going to take Memorial Day to memorialize them.
mhm.
Um, and this way of repurposing, it's in much the way they have. I mean, Christmas was not always a a consumerist holiday, right?
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
capitalist, like, yeah, we can there is a tradition of gift giving,
Mhm.
so we can repurpose that, right, and
Mhm.
make it this major consumer capitalist enterprise. That
Mhm.
again, I mentioned the way in which Thanksgiving signals a particular part, holiday season, but really it's signaled by Halloween.
Right.
As the
Right.
fall
Right.
holidays are
Right.
approaching, it's actually
Yes.
signaled by Halloween, and
Mhm.
I know we've seen over
Mhm.
the years how the shopping season, right?
Mhm.
It's now the
It's gotten
shopping
longer and
season
longer.
starts in October, right?
Right. Yes.
And now you can actually get Halloween decorations. That wasn't a thing, and even these
Right.
Thanksgiving decorations, right? That
Right.
people can sort of take their fall colors of Halloween and they can still be the Thanksgiving colors, and then you flip to Christmas
Yeah.
colors, right? And
Yeah.
um, so anyway, it's
Yeah.
we've been at it for an hour and a half, and we said
We
we wanted
have.
to go 2 hours. So yeah, I think we can bring this to a close now and not go for another half hour.
I think so.
The
I would tend to agree.
Yes, but yeah, that's the conversation we wanted to have tonight on
Yeah.
this. Yes, this what are we giving thanks for? That's my little prayer every morning. I wake up, I give thanks. Just I woke up, so that's giving some thanks, and that'll do. I understand cultures setting aside festival times and festival days. That seems quite human to me, right? A
Absolutely.
common human activity. But why do societies create holidays? And they have that purpose of reinforcing, retelling the narrative,
Absolutely.
right? Retelling the story of the society and
Yes.
reinforcing its values and
Absolutely.
this
The memory,
particular the memory,
the
and that is the
collective memory.
job of this holiday. And
Yes.
so, we're just trying to disrupt that a little bit, right? There is another
Mhm.
side to that story, and it is not the official story, right? It is not the Squanto and whomever Miles Standish, I don't know,
Whoever,
friendship
whatever,
story,
any
right?
of them. Yeah.
The Pilgrims and Squanto, right? There's
Yeah.
that's the myth, whatever
Yes.
kernel of truth may be in it.
Yeah.
That's the myth. Because again, I still take as a kernel of truth in the story that the local indigenous people helped those settlers learn how to
Absolutely.
survive because of their
Absolutely.
own
And I'm
human
sure they were very grateful.
values. Exactly.
But
And
the
then
colonizer has a mysterious way of being able to befriend and murder at the same time.
that's
I can
sometimes how
befriend you
they demonstrate their gratitude. Um,
and thank you so much.
so we should
But
always remember that the auto de fe, right? The auto de fe, the act of faith, when they would burn witches and heretics at the stake, right? The Catholic Church of the late medieval, early modern period. It was an act of faith. We're doing you a favor
mm,
because you're going to confess.
and save your soul.
We're going to save your soul, and then we're
Yeah.
going to burn you before you can sin again,
y-
and that way you'll get into heaven. It's an act. So yes, see, that's all we're doing. we're
This we're,
we're
we're
showing
doing a
our
good.
gratitude, and
We're
now
doing
we're
a good.
gonna eliminate you from the misery of your life, your unchristian life. And
Yes.
that's all. So it's a perverted act of distorted mercy in
Hmm.
in the mind of the settler. The
And
so
here we are
and
at
here we are.
8:33 and
So
wishing you all, anyone who is joining us or anyone who will view and enjoys the conversation, wishing you safety and security,
yeah,
solidarity,
yeah,
growing relations and networks of solidarity,
yes,
as we go forward and create solid, meaningful, lasting change in mind and thinking, and the dissolution of all that is anti-human and anti-humanity and anti-nature and anti-life, um, going forward.
okay. What was that? 364 days a year. Today you can take back your thanks. No thank you for the enslavement. No thank you for the colonization. No thank you for your brand of Christianity. We give Jah all the thanks and praises. And with that, let me remind you, if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe, please like, and please share. If you're watching on Facebook, you can do all those same things. And we plan on being back next week. I think about that time, next Thursday,
Conversation. Yeah.
Nico will be, I think, a month old about that time.
Look out.
Sounds about right. Give or take a day. Yeah, I think
Look
so.
out.
Yeah. So,
The
yeah,
new grandchild.
that's
Yes.
right. So anyway, folks, we appreciate you. Solidarity forever. And we will see you next week.